Well, today we're going to be doing a deep dive on Prince Harry's astrological chart, but we're going to be doing a deep dive in a very specific area of his chart, and that's going to be looking at the marriage that he has with Meghan Markle. Now, this is going to be from Prince Harry's point of view and his astrological chart point of view. So this should be very interesting to look at. This is going to be the most in-depth analysis I've done as far as looking at Prince Harry's marriage. So those of you that are really interested in getting a lot of detail, this video is going to be for you. Now, for those of you that are new to my channel, make sure you like and subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can get all of the notifications and all the videos. I do videos on the royal family quite frequently. Occasionally, I do celebrity videos and then also important astrological events and so forth. If you're interested in a personal private reading, check down below for details. And then also, I do want to bring up that this reading is for entertainment purposes only. When we're talking about Prince Harry, these are all allegedlys, and we're just speculating as to the astrological energies. So let's go ahead and I'm going to talk about some of the outline of some of the things we're going to be looking at when we look at marriage. What I want to bring up before we really dive into this is that marriage is a complicated thing. It's, there's some good aspects of it and there's some negative. So with this reading, you're going to notice that it's very complicated. It's mixed. It's not entirely good. It's not entirely bad. And I know that especially when we think about Meghan and Harry, we can kind of think that it's like a very polarized kind of, as far as the fans are, right? But if we look at the marriage, we're going to notice that it's a lot more nuanced and there's a lot more, it's complicated, like I said. Now let's go ahead and talk about some of the factors we're going to be looking at since this is a deep dive. So there's a few factors we're looking at in the astrological chart. We're going to be looking at the 7th house, which is the marriage house. We're going to be looking at the condition of the 7th lord. We're going to be looking at the condition of Venus in the chart because that represents marriage. And we're also going to be looking at 7th from moon. And then we're going to get some details out of the Navamsa chart as well. So there's a lot of things to look at when we're analyzing a marriage. Now, let's go ahead and break down the 7th house in Prince Harry's chart. And let me pull up the screen for myself. This is the 7th house right over here in Prince Harry's chart. And I know that the frame that I'm in is kind of covering it. But what I want you to know is there's no planets in the 7th house. And that's okay. So if you see no planets in the 7th house, you can still get quite a bit of information. So the other thing we're going to be looking at, is there any aspects that are happening to the 7th house? And yes, there's actually 2 aspects. The first aspect we're going to be talking about is the Jupiter aspect. And let's go ahead and talk about that right now. So Jupiter, it aspects 5 houses from itself, 7 houses from itself, and 9 houses from itself. So it's receiving Jupiter's 7th aspect. So that gives us some indication about the marriage. Now, the Jupiter aspect is actually considered a really good aspect as far as marriage goes. If you have Venus or Jupiter aspecting your 7th house, it's considered a good omen. It's considered like it's adding a pleasant aspect to the marriage. And let me bring up the slide here so we can talk about that. So Jupiter, what it represents is a relationship where they may have a common philosophy. There's a sense of optimism there. At least from Prince Harry's point of view, the spouse may seem supportive. And it might seem like they just share a common outlook on life. Now, I don't know exactly what their core philosophy is, but it's a generally optimistic outlook, and they're intending, at least there's this idealism about the marriage where they're intending for things to keep growing. So there's definitely this sense of like, okay, we're getting in this marriage and things are going to keep growing and getting better as we move along. Now, we're going to find out throughout this whole analysis that I'm doing that it's not that easy. There's there's some negative factors there too. There's some obstacles, delays, and things of, well, will this idealism really work out in the long term? That's why if you look at the bottom of the slide there, it says, you can be very idealistic, but this could lead to disappointment if not managed properly. So the idealism, if you're not mature about the idealism, it could be kind of naive in a lot of ways. Now let's go take a look at the next aspect. So the Jupiter aspect is a really good aspect, believe it or not. Okay, let's go take a look at the other aspect in the chart. And let me clean up the chart for a moment. The other aspect, and this is considered more of an inauspicious aspect, by the way, is going to be the Mars aspect. So Mars, it aspects, and let me number the houses for you. So Mars aspects the houses, 4 houses from itself, 7 houses from itself, and 8 houses from itself. And the most powerful aspects of Mars are going to be on the fourth aspect and the eighth aspect. Okay. So basically, Mars is aspecting. I know I'm calling it the eighth aspect, but it's the seventh house that it's aspecting. Okay. So Mars is aspecting the seventh house, 100% aspect. Okay. And this is something called Kuja dosha. And Kuja dosha is considered inauspicious in a lot of ways. It's considered too much Mars energy in a marriage. In traditionally, it's kind of a dreaded actually omen within astrology. It's like not seen as necessarily a good thing, but it's actually more neutral than that. I'll explain it a little more in detail. Now, if you're watching this and you have Kuja dosha, don't panic. It's not a horrible thing. One thing I like to bring up with my clients is 1 out of every 3 charts has Kuja dosha because Mars can be in 3 different houses and you can have Kuja dosha. So this isn't horrible, but it does add some complications and issues. Okay, and we're going to be talking about that right now. Let me bring up the slide. Now with the Kuja dosha, it's considered generally inauspicious in a marriage. It can bring up marital conflicts, arguments, bickering, misunderstanding, just because there's too much Mars energy. So it's not necessarily recommended to be like in close quarters like all day long. So it's the remedy for that is to give each other a lot of space, a lot of freedom. Make sure that you have a channel for those Mars energies. Now, also the Kuja dosha, it can bring up financial problems, like I say in the slide, but it's not with all the Kuja doshas. But we're going to be talking specifically about this particular one in Prince Harry's chart. Let me bring up the chart again. A why? Why would it bring up some financial issues? Well, we got to look at where Mars is in the astrology chart. So Mars is in the 12th house of Scorpio. And I'm just going to show the aspect again. And the 12th house can represent losses and expenditures. So it's this idea of like losing money or losing wealth that can bring up some conflicts because you have to look at where Mars is when it's aspecting the marriage house. So the location of where Mars is gives us some information as well. So that could be a sore spot. If there's any type of losses that are accrued in the relationship, it could lead, at least astrologically, it could lead to some conflict in the relationship there. So that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, Kuja dosha, by the way, it can just create a general sense of incompatibility. Now, it's not entirely bad if we take a neutral point of view. It can actually create a lot of passion in a relationship. So, for example, you might have seen those couples where they like argue a lot, and then all of a sudden, there's this really romantic side of them. Well, sometimes Mars can do that if it's properly channeled. But you have to be very conscious on how you channel the Mars energy. So, if I was talking to Prince Harry, I would say, I would encourage both spouses to have an outlet for their Mars energy, take yoga classes, martial arts classes, go to the gym, give each other plenty of space. If somebody wants to run off to the store, just let them run off to the store. That's the kind of the general remedies when we have Kuja dosha, besides the Vedic remedies, which would be wearing like red coral and chanting the mantra of Mars. Now, let me go ahead and we're going to talk about the next indicator in the astrology chart, and that's going to be the condition of the seventh lord. Okay, so in Vedic astrology, we not only look at the seventh house, but what planet owns or rules the seventh house, and this is going to be the sign of Gemini. So that's going to be Mercury. So we really want to look at what is the condition of Mercury because it's the seventh lord. A few observations right off the bat. It's in the ninth house, so this could be a very philosophically focused marriage. Just like we said with the Jupiter aspect, the ninth house is considered an auspicious house. It's one of the trine houses. Now it is next to Sun, and Sun can create like it's influencing Mercury like a very charismatic type of spouse, and we already know that. I mean, Megan was in TV, and she's been an actress. Um, it's actually they're not combust, actually they're more than 20 degrees apart, so Mercury as it isn't combust. If it was combust, it would create some more complicated issues, but in this case Mercury is actually not really bad, and it's not being aspected by Saturn or Mars, so it's not in a bad placement at all for this, you know as far as this seventh lord analysis. So again, because Mercury's in the ninth house, it can create a spouse that's very intellectually, like, I feel like there's a lot of compatibility with their discussions. They may have a lot of deep discussions. There's an intellectual connection, philosophy. Maybe they have even a similar spiritual belief system. I know that when I saw the documentary, they both were like calling like their meditation teacher. Do you all remember that? And they were doing like a meditation. So maybe they have a similar philosophy. It's also in the sign of Leo, which can create again a charismatic spouse. It also has the Jupiter aspect. So remember, Jupiter's aspecting the seventh house, and it's also aspecting Mercury in the chart. So that's also another good aspect. That's another good omen in the chart. Now we're going to be getting into some more of the challenging aspects of the marriage analysis here. So, hold on. Let's talk about the next factor here when we're talking about the astrology chart, and that's going to be the condition of Venus within the chart. So let's talk about that. Remember, Venus represents traditionally marriage relationships, and it represents contracts, because the reason why Venus naturally represents marriage is because it rules the seventh house of Libra in an astrology chart. So keep that in mind. So Venus in the chart here, it's in the 10th house, and we're going to talk about a Virgo, but it is debilitated. So this is kind of one of the, besides the Kuja dosha, we have the debilitation of Venus, which is not necessarily a good aspect when we're looking at the marriage situation in Prince Harry's chart. So let's talk about what that means. So one of the things I want to point out is when you have Venus in the 10th house, it could represent a spouse that's very career oriented. And I think we already know that, right? I mean, she was already very focused on her career. And I think that even after they've been married, she's been really focused on trying to, earn money, especially when they moved to California. So very career oriented, very, very concerned. The spouse is very concerned about their public reputation, because that's what 10th house is. I mean, 10th house is like your public reputation, how much respect you get from the public. Now it's debilitated. So there's some issues there. Okay. So it can actually create some weakness in the relationship. So, one of the things that I noticed with the Venus being debilitated is, in general, romantic relationships for Prince Harry maybe just like a sore spot, or very difficult. Like maybe it's difficult to fully connect, or difficult to have like a really genuine romance. Like one of those romances where there isn't all these other ulterior motives and different factors going on. So with Venus being debilitated, I mean, there is a sense of optimism because of the Jupiter aspects going on, but Venus being debilitated could create like a lack of like romantic spontaneity and things like that. And then that actually can be kind of a more difficult aspect, because you do need that in a, especially in a long-term marriage, it's good to have some romance in there as well. Now let's talk about Venus being in the sign of Virgo. There's definitely perfectionism and criticism is going to be some of the themes in the relationship. They already have a lot of critics, so that's definitely going to be indicated there. But also, it might be something that they're both working on each other. So perfectionism, like maybe trying to promote this perfect image, might also be an issue as well. So this can be a weakness within the relationship. It's not weak necessarily that Venus is in the 10th house. It's more this difficult aspect of being in the sign of Virgo and then being debilitated. So that's kind of like where some of the problems may actually lie. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about the next factor. Okay, seventh from Moon. And I've talked about this in some of my other astrology readings. Let's talk about seventh from moon in the astrology chart here. Let me bring up the chart and let me clean it up from our past discussion here. So, besides looking at the seventh house, you also want to look at seventh from moon for the emotional relationship or emotional focus of the relationship. So, if we look at, and I'm numbering the houses from the moon, we got seventh from moon is going to be the 11th house. And one of the difficult factors is going to be Saturn is there. Okay. So, this is going to be the emotional experience of marriage. Remember, a lot of our experiences are essentially emotional. Like if you think about like the times you've had in your life, it's usually you're looking at like where were the times in my life where I felt really good or I felt really bad. So that's why when we're looking at seventh from moon, it's critical. It's like the emotional flavor of a relationship. So 11th house, we're going to talk about that. And we're going to also talk about what Saturn is here, and we're going to cover it pretty quickly. So let me bring that up. So when you have an seventh from moon, when it's the 11th house, it can actually be the emotional focus of the marriage is like friendships, networks, economic gains, similar aspirations and goals. A lot of times this relationship starts out as a friendship. Okay, because the 11th house is all about friendships. So and when I look at the overall chart, it does seem that way. It seems like there's common friendships, common discussions, and it would kind of started out. It may have started out on that note. It wasn't like a Rahu kind of like, you know, relationship that ends up being like this whirlwind relationship. Very, kind of that's what Rahu would be. So this is more of like we are friends, we're talking, we're interested. That's kind of the sense from this chart. Now, let's talk about Saturn being seventh from moon because that's going to create some difficulties there. Okay, so for example, the relationship may feel too serious, and remember, this is Prince Harry point of view. Maybe he wants more romance, but there's a feeling of seriousness there and responsibility and emotional restraint. Okay, there could be a lot of mental stress with Saturn being there. There's a sense of burden. There might be a sense of burden. And this shows up a lot of times the longer you've been married. This is when Saturn kind of rears its head. It's kind of like, okay, now I'm creating this sense of there's this emotional weight that's there. The relationship can feel very duty oriented. So now I don't know what their day-to-day life is in their house. Maybe like who does the chores, but it can seem like, okay, you get up every day and maybe it's a to-do list of what you're both going to do. And maybe it can be a feeling of a lack of romantic spontaneity, which the debilitated Venus can lean towards. There's also the potential for distance, like emotional distancing. And this can happen because one of the spouses are too busy. Maybe there's too many duties. Maybe they're doing side work. And there can be a sense of isolation and loneliness at times in this relationship. So the 11th house is actually the 11th house. The fact that it's the 11th house isn't bad in and of itself because you actually want a spouse that you can talk to a lot. But Saturn's kind of like the what they say the fly in the ointment. It's kind of like adding this stress, responsibility, and this distancing that can happen within the relationship. Now we're going to talk about the Navamsa chart for a moment. And we're not doing a full Navamsa chart analysis, but we're going to take a look at a few factors of the Navamsa chart. So let me go ahead and pull that up for you all. And let me change the chart for a moment. So, oops, let me click on. Okay, so here's the Navamsa chart. Now, a couple of the things we want to look at in the Navamsa chart. Remember, in astrology, the Navamsa chart is considered the chart that really represents the spiritual purpose of marriage. And a lot of times, that's what you look at when you're trying to analyze a marriage. Is you focus a lot on the Navamsa chart. That's why we need usually a really good birth time in Vedic astrology, because when we start generating the supplemental charts, they require like a degree of accuracy to be able to really generate these charts. So the Navamsa chart gives us like the spiritual and emotional aspects of the marriage. Because the Navamsa is associated with the ninth house. It's like the fruits of Dharma. So it'll be like the spiritual purpose of a marriage. Now, remember, Vedic astrology is very much rooted in like religious thought. Okay. So if we think about it, like it's very much rooted in yoga. And so everything when they think of a marriage, it's considered like a spiritual yoga. It's considered that it's supposed to be helping you on your path. The Navamsa will show if the marriage is actually going to be helping you or kind of harming you on your spiritual path in a lot of ways. So that's what we're looking at when we look at the Navamsa chart. Now let's go look at a few aspects. One of the things we want to look at in the Navamsa chart, since it is the chart that really represents marriage, is we want to look at the condition of the Lord of the chart. And also keep in mind the first house would represent Prince Harry in the Navamsa chart. And this is going to be Mercury again. So that's kind of interesting that Mercury rules the seventh house of the D1 chart, and then it rules the first house of the Navamsa chart. We're going to look at basically what's happening with Mercury. And then we're also going to be looking at the seventh house of the Navamsa chart. If you look at the seventh house, there are some malefics there. So this is going to give us some emotional and kind of psychological, astrological interpretation here. But we got Saturn and Rahu. So that's kind of a complicated energy there. Okay, so let me bring up this chart. So we're going to be talking about the condition of Mercury and then Saturn and Rahu in the seventh house of the Navamsa chart. And so Mercury, it's interesting. It's in the 11th house. And let me double check on that. It's in the 11th house of the Navamsa chart, which is quite interesting. Remember, we talked about the seventh from Moon was the 11th house. Again, Mercury in the Navamsa, in the 11th house of the Navamsa, could represent a marriage that that's really focused on social networks, gains, goals. Again, so we have that other factor here that's kind of letting into this idea. It's very much focused on like material success, material goals, making new friends, connections, those kind of things. It could be very much indicated there. But the one thing I will point out is Mercury's not very strong in the sign of Cancer. In fact, it's not debilitated, but it's in a very bad sign. So Mercury does not do well in the sign of Cancer, because we have to look at like how strong is the Lord. If the Lord is not doing well, it could represent like it affects the happiness level. So if the Lord is in a bad house, Mercury is in a bad house, it can represent like happiness is being affected. It's being mitigated in some sort of way. Now let's talk about, remember we said Rahu and Saturn are in the seventh house of the Navamsa chart. Now Rahu in the seventh house can create, for example, a spouse that's actually a foreigner. And in Prince Harry's case, isn't that true? I mean, Meghan Markle is American. And so she's a foreigner. It also can create someone who's unusual, at least from the customs of what Prince Harry's used to. So she might have a lot of peculiar patterns that, well, he was raised in a very tradition, like a royal household. There's a lot of decorum. So a lot of this stuff might be very fascinating to him on like what she does on a day-to-day level. And but Rahu in the seventh can create a desire for material success, because Rahu is associated with desire. I also want to point out that Rahu can create a certain mesmerizing of Prince Harry. So the spouse is very mesmerizing. Rahu can be associated with like a snake charmer almost. Like it's this idea of being like, being very much mesmerized or persuaded by the spouse. And so there is this mesmerizing element to that. Now let's talk about Saturn in the seventh house. By the way, I do want to point out Rahu and Saturn together, either in the D1 chart or the Navamsa chart. If Rahu and Saturn are conjunct, it can actually indicate somebody who's like a shaman or somebody who's involved in like witchcraft or something like that. In this case, it would be the spouse, because Rahu and Saturn are in the seventh house. Now, I want to say that's a very extreme interpretation, but it could represent somebody that knows how to communicate with spirits, and I find that quite interesting. So that's quite interesting. So that would be the spouse, with Rahu and Saturn being in the seventh house of the Navamsa. That would be more indicative of the spouse. Now let's talk about Saturn in the seventh house. It's just like we had with the Saturn in seventh from Moon. Remember, so there's a sense of heavy responsibility towards a marriage. There's a priority of stability, commitment, longevity. There is a certain seriousness about it. that might not seem very romantic from Prince Harry's point of view in the Navamsa chart. Also, I do want to point out Saturn, and let's go back to the Navamsa chart really quick. One of the difficult aspects to have in your Navamsa chart or even your D1 chart is if you have the sixth lord. And remember, so we got Saturn there and it rules the sixth house. So the sixth lord is in the seventh house. Now, sometimes this can create obstacles, it can create disputes, disagreements, envy, or jealousy in the relationship. Okay, because the sixth lord is all those things like gossip, envy, jealousy. Remember, I'm not saying that that's the fact, but astrologically, that's what the sixth house represents. There's some sort of disagreement or disharmony there that could be astrologically indicated there. So that's going to be a very difficult type of aspect. So, for example, the sixth lord in the seventh house could represent disputes, disagreements, conflicts in the marriage, and there may be power struggles between the differing perspectives of the partners. So that can be a very difficult aspect. Now, you saw that we looked at like 5 different qualities or different things we can look at in the marriage chart. I wanted to give you a little bit of a synthesis of what we kind of learned from all this, because it wasn't entirely bad and it wasn't entirely good. I mean, it was a, if we look at the chart, there's a lot of factors there. The Jupiter aspect, the optimism, the common goals, the philosophy, that's all good. But then there's some negative aspects as well. Let me go ahead and let's talk about some of that, some of these in my synthesis here. So marriage is complicated like any other relationship. From the point of view of the marriage, the astrology chart, the marriage is very much focused on material goals, aspirations, has a strong intellectual and philosophical component to the marriage. They may have a lot to talk about on a day-to-day basis. They just like agree maybe intellectually, philosophically, but there are negatives in the chart as well. So we have the Kuja dosha, which can bring up conflicts. And also being in the 12th house, this can be conflicts due to material concerns, or maybe it's a lack of achieving their goals that can create some sort of conflict. We have Saturn in the 7th from Moon, and we also have Saturn in the 7th house of the Navamsa chart. Those are kind of bad indicators, which can indicate a certain emotional coldness or a relationship that's too much focused on duty and goals, where it can feel like the romance is not necessarily, a strong factor in the marriage. So Venus also is debilitated in the D1 chart, which can indicate difficulty in expressing romantic charm, very much duty oriented. So if I was just to like think of it on my own, it feels like from the astrology chart that the marriage is very focused on goals, material success, and but if we want to think about the actual like romantic part of it, there could be some difficulty there with the Venus debilitated and then Saturn involved everywhere. It's like very duty bound. Maybe the spouse, because Venus is in the 10th house, the spouse could be very concerned about the public image and trying to make it, especially if we consider, if we back up for a second, just consider that we're not doing astrology in a vacuum. If we consider that Harry and Meghan, they essentially resigned from their royal duties and then they moved away. And so there really is this pressure of like, we really got to look like we can make it on our own now. We really have to succeed or else people will say we're a failure. That could be kind of the mentality. Like, so it's like, we really got to work hard to make this work and present this presentable image. And that could be indicated in the chart. Let me know what you think down below in the comments. I'm going to be very interested to read, some of the comments and some of the opinions you have. I know some of this reading, some of the things were repetitive because there was like the same kind of aspect, but I think it gave us a strong confluence on like what's really going on from the point of view of Prince Harry. I found it very interesting with the Rahu and the Saturn in the 7th house of the Navamsa chart. There's a certain, just knowing there's that mesmerizing quality of the spouse that's being experienced there too. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think, of course, and I will see you all in the next one.